Wir machen weiter und zwar mit dem nächsten Thema digitaler Hass und verbale Gewalt im Netz und im Speziellen verbale Gewalt gegen Frauen im Netz. Bevor wir starten, eine Sache noch. Es gibt einen Hashtag und der heißt Hashtag MCB19 und ihr seid alle herzlichst eingeladen zu twittern, zu Instagram, zu Facebooken oder was man sonst so macht. Snapchat und Co., ihr wisst es alle besser. Das nächste Thema liegt mir super am Herzen, weil es ein sehr, sehr wichtiges Thema ist und vielleicht ist euch aufgefallen, ich bin schwarz, Surprise, und auch noch Deutscher. Das ist für viele im Netz nicht auszuhalten. Deswegen bekomme ich, wenn ich Videos im Netz mache, oft sehr, sehr krassen Hass. Aber ich weiß, dass es nochmal bei meinen weiblichen KollegInnen ganz, ganz anders ist. Und auch wenn die Frauen dann auch noch auf Color sind oder muslimisch, dann geht das Hassbarometer unfassbar krass nach oben. Und deswegen freue ich mich sehr, dass Courtney Tenz heute da ist und über ihre Strategien mit Hass im Netz erzählen wird. Und der Titel ist, Achtung, es ist ein bisschen, soll ich sagen, TH-Alarm, ich hoffe, ich bekomme es hin, Dick Pics and Death Threats gegen Handling Web Harassment. Ich freue mich sehr, Courtney. Und wir haben Zeit für Fragen danach noch, so circa 5 Minuten am Ende. Jetzt geht's los, danke dir.
Hi, thanks for coming today. I want to just tell you at the beginning, I guess there should be a trigger warning because we're going to be talking about the things that we experience online. But I won't get into any details about the experiences that women have had because I think that that can itself be traumatizing to hear what happens to other journalists online. Just a little bit about myself. I'm actually a freelance journalist. I'm American, but I live in Germany. That means that I write for a variety of publications that are not based in Germany. I also write for Deutsche Welle and other international organizations, and I am, online, mostly in English. That means that my experiences are a little bit different than your experiences probably are. But at the same time, what we're noticing around the world is that the trend towards harassing women online, especially women journalists, is increasing, and it's not limited to any particular country or geographical location. That also means that the people who are perpetrating the online attacks are not based specifically in Germany. That means you can be attacked by people from around the world, which is quite a change from what was happening previously to journalists. 20 years ago, it would be rare if you got a death threat from Australia when you were working in Germany, but now we can get them every day. I also wanted to point out the title is a little bit different on my presentation than it was in the program, just because we had to shorten it. But I initially wrote it as From Dick Pics to Death Threats, which suggests that there actually is a spectrum of harassment, that there are levels to the harassment, and I think that that's something that's important to have a conversation about and to keep in mind, because what happens often is that people hear about colleagues experiencing certain things, and I think that you can ask most women who are underway online, have you ever gotten a picture of a penis that you didn't ask for? And a number of them would say, yes, I did. But if you had asked them that maybe 15 years ago, they would say, what? Who would send you a picture of their penis without you asking for it, right? So we've gotten to a point now where it's so commonplace that we kind of minimize that this thing is happening, yeah? And it's important to pay attention to that, as that minimization, so that we don't at some point become accustomed to this being normal. We're not normalizing the harassment of women online. We're not normalizing non-consensual exchange of messages like that. It's also important to not be ranking each other, not saying, well, you know, I only got harassed 3 times, but you have gotten death threats, so it must be so much worse for you. What I'm saying is that every step of the way counts, and every spot on this spectrum is something that we need to be paying attention to. All right? The first question I get when I talk about this topic is always, why women, right? Men receive death threats as much as women do, or they receive violent commentaries. But what we're noticing among women journalists is that we are targeted with more frequency and with, we'll say, harder actions, right? When we're receiving hate mail or death threats or non-consensual pictures, we're receiving them at a pace that is much higher than what our male counterparts are doing. There was one study that showed if you were in a chat room with a feminine name, you were getting 100 death threats versus a man's 3.7, right, per time spent online. We also know that 70% of women working in media have self-reported that they've been harassed online. The International Women's Media Foundation that did this study said that prior to the survey, at least 52% of them had admitted to being harassed. There are other statistics that say 2/3 of women surveyed. The problem with these statistics, these are all really high statistics, is that they're all self-reporting. We also know that a lot of women don't report that they've been harassed. So we have to kind of take that into consideration, that women are reporting that they're being harassed, but maybe not everybody. But we also have to take into consideration that the kind of threats that women are getting are much different than the kind of threats that men are getting. And we'll come back to that in just a second, because the next thing I want to talk about is why it's happening. Essentially, these threats and explicit pictures and so on are, for the most part, being perpetrated by men. It can be real men. It can be also bots that are released by nation states or governments. And these are coming through to women based on the notion that if I detract from this woman's agency, I'm going to detract from her credibility. So if I'm a journalist and I'm reporting on something and people start to question whether or not I'm a valid source, then my reporting is going to be put into question, right? So you could see why a nation state or government would want to do that. If you're reporting on corruption, or you're reporting on crime, or you're reporting on wars, of course you're going to be targeted. I shouldn't say that, of course, but it's likely that you'll be targeted, in part to minimize your credibility, but also as part of a disinformation campaign or a misinformation campaign. At the same time, this targeting relies very much on the societal structures that exist, right? So you're targeted based on your gender because of the gender roles and the misogyny that exists within the society that you live in. That also means that the kind of statements that are used are often responded to in the sense of, like, women shouldn't have a voice, women belong in the kitchen, they shouldn't be speaking about these subjects, on the one hand. On the other hand, we know, for example, that the people who are most often targeted are people who talk about race, who talk about political issues, who in some way have an opinion on something that isn't beauty or fashion, right? That's the idea of the pink ghetto. As long as you stay in your lane, we won't harass you. We also know, though, that women who talk about women's rights are targeted, and that's just another part of the structure. Essentially, what we're seeing is the sexist hierarchies that exist in the real world are just being translated into the digital world. I think this shouldn't be anything new for people who are interested in women's rights and who've been following it, but some of the things that are coming to light now is that the protective measures that we've taken in the past, for example, getting verified on Twitter or getting verified on Instagram, is actually targeting us. They've discovered that there are people who believe that because you have a high follower account, you are the best target, and so once you get your blue check on Instagram, then you're going to start getting more hate mail or lovely comments in your inbox and so on. What I want to talk about now really quick is the way that this abuse works, because I did talk about it initially as a spectrum, but it's a variety of different things, different tactics that people are using. I think we're all familiar with them: flaming, slurs, things like Google bombing, where they switch their SEOs so that your name comes up with propaganda instead of with your actual reporting. There is doxing, which is something that a lot of women have experienced as a result of an article that they wrote. Their personal details are posted online, their home address, where their child goes to kindergarten. They're taking pictures that we have posted online of ourselves and creating pornographic videos with them. And that tends to work in societies in which women are objectified and over-sexualized, but in which also then their reputation is damaged by these deep fakes. We also see that they're retaliating against people who openly support the victims of these. This wheel I took from the Women's Media Center, which also has a great resource online, basic things that you should know about the topic, how to handle it, but also what counts under online harassment. And it's set up as a wheel, which is an interesting way of looking at it, because I originally, I came to journalism actually from trauma psychology. How do women deal with trauma? And this is very similar in concept to something called the power control cycle. And the power control cycle is something that abusers use to keep their victims in their place, right? It's things like, using their children as collateral damage, threatening to use their children in an abusive situation in order to maintain control. And you can kind of see that that is working in the digital world in terms of harassment, because you're trying so hard, once you've been the target of harassment, to mitigate the risks that you take and to mitigate the threats that are being targeted against you, that you can no longer live a normal life. The general idea behind this presentation or this workshop is for other people to exchange their ideas and have a discussion about what works, what doesn't work, because I think probably many of you have been the target of harassment online, or if not, you've known somebody who is. And that's something else that I think we need to talk about, which is that just because you aren't the one who's being targeted right now doesn't mean that you're not experiencing the effects of that harassment. And one of the ways that we experience that harassment ourselves is that there are fewer stories being told by women. What we know from newsrooms in particular is that around the world, 24% of bylines are by women. We also know that women are allowed access into situations that men are not allowed into. That means that reporting, especially from a conflict zone or from a society where women's rights are not as forward as they are here in Germany, that women get access to women's issues, to issues of the family, issues of what's going on with their children. These stories are not told always to men. That means that we're losing out on a lot of stories being told because women aren't able to tell the stories because they're too busy protecting themselves from the kinds of harassment that they experience. We also know, sorry, I'm just going to check this note here for a second, that editors will say, you're only one story away from being targeted, which means that journalists who are familiar with experience or who have witnessed harassment online are going to be less likely to pitch a story that follows a similar trend. That means that if you were once reporting on refugees and received a torrent of abuse afterwards, you're going to be less likely to report on refugees the next time. You might be more willing to give that to your male colleagues, which could mean that the story is still being told, but it's going to be coming from a different angle because it's written from a male colleague instead of a female colleague. In order to sort of prepare ourselves for those kinds of experiences, we need to actually bring in more newsrooms and more editorial staff from the management level to have a discussion about how we can continue to tell those stories from the female perspective, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But in the first place, or the first steps that we have to take are just very basic digital hygiene. Things like don't post pictures of your children online. Don't let your friends tag where you are at any moment. Don't make plans publicly. Right? People on Twitter saying, I'm going to be at Republica at 10:30 at this place, puts people into danger, right? If you don't know that this person is being targeted, but you've mentioned online that that person's going to be there, you might have a problem in the future. And I say this knowing full well that this is not the solution. It should not be the solution that women limit their lives, limit their public lives, limit their private lives. But we also know that there are women in the US right now who won't give a presentation like this without security. We know that they have had to move houses, that they've had to change their phone numbers because the harassment is never ending. And some of the things that are being done to them is not technically illegal or not technically traceable, which makes it really hard for them to get the police protection that they require. In Germany, our hate speech laws are different, but there is the question of if this perpetrator is sitting somewhere else, if they're sitting in another country, can we actually do anything about it? Do we need to fear that that person could come to this convention or could show up where you are? Those are all things that we need to sort of have in the back of our minds while we're talking about this issue. But to date, the people who've done the most research on what you can do to mitigate damage have all leaned towards this idea of women minimizing their risk by withdrawing from the digital world. right? That means these tips are the ones that have been passed down. We also know that these tips are a little bit older. They come from experiences that happened before 2016, and we also know that since 2016, the violence and threats online has gotten much worse. This comes from the organization called Trollbusters, which is sort of like a checklist. If you're having a hard time, what are the things that are happening to you? What should you do in that situation? Some of the tips they seem to be common sense, but in the moment that it happens, you may not be thinking that these are your best moves, right? When somebody tells you you're a stupid whore, do you respond to that? Do you delete that? Do you report it? Is it worth your time? You go through all these questions in your head. And so Trollbusters has set up some materials online for you to help determine the best path for yourself. Because I also want to say that every person who experiences online harassment will handle it in a different way. There are things that we know that work and things that we know that don't work, but everybody has to choose their own path for response. And it's also something that we should think about. What is it worth to me to have this engagement with this person, right? If it's going to make me have a bad day because I'm responding to a person who's called me a name, then maybe that's not the right tactic for me. Maybe I just won't respond to that person. Let me just take a deep breath here and say that one of the things we also have to be aware of is that sometimes when people are undergoing harassment, other people will give them advice on how best to handle it, and that's a bad tactic. Yeah? If a person decides how they want to handle it, that's what you have to go with, and your role as a person who's observing it is to support that person in whatever choices they're making. If they've decided, I'm going to respond to this person, it's, I think there was a presentation called Counter Speech, how do we respond to these people with facts and so on, they can do that. If that person has decided that they want to ignore it, they can ignore it. These, again, are these older tips from 2013, 2014. I believe this one came from the Women's Media Center as well, which is that we want to pay attention to documenting everything. That means screenshot everything and start making a file. I think yesterday they had an app that was presented here on cyber stalking where you can start filing away all of these hateful messages that you get. But they do say that you should document it so that you can prove that it's something that happens over the long term. Because if you do report to the police and you just get like one picture of a penis, the police will say, it's a picture, right? But if you can prove that this person is repeatedly doing it, then you might be able to get a step further in your reporting. And that is something else that we've seen, at least in American studies. Amanda Hess is a very famous journalist in the US who was stalked pretty extensively. And she many times went to the police. And the first thing that they said to her is, what's Twitter, right? So they didn't know how to best to handle it, and then at some point they said, log off, right? So we need to be taking a little bit of into our own hands, documenting these experiences, determining what's worth taking to the police, what's worth not taking to the police, determining if there are laws being broken, because sometimes these people who harass understand exactly the limits of what legally is punitive. But one of the other things that you need to really pay attention to, or that I want to talk about next, is this bottom part, which is to speak to your boss. In Finland, they've had the experience with several journalists, including Jessica Aro, who I think became quite famous because she was uninvited to the White House. But she was a target of a hate campaign several years ago. And she had to get her bosses involved in her harassment because it was extending into her work life. They created this poster that you can hang in every newsroom. And unfortunately, it's not great resolution here on the screen. But generally, the idea is that you have to know that you're not alone. And you have to have some resources that are set up by your boss. This presumes that you're not a freelancer like I am. This presumes that you work within a newsroom. And if you do work within a newsroom, what you really want from your boss is a boss who will say to you, I believe you. How can I help? What we know is that every woman experiences trauma differently, right? And so we talked originally about this spectrum from dick pics to death threats, right? Every woman will respond to a picture of a penis differently, right? Some of them may be totally offended. Some may think this is the most disgusting thing they've ever seen. Some may just say, oh, whatever, I've seen it before. everybody responds to it differently. And a part of that response comes from the ingrained traumas that we live every day, which means that if you're already in an unstable position, or if you're already recalling other experiences that you've had in your life, these kinds of threats are going to impact you much more heavily. But the biggest determiner of how a woman handles trauma like this is how the person that they first tell afterwards reacts. So if you go into your newsroom and you tell your boss, look, I'm getting harassed online, and he says, God, just give it a rest, okay? Just don't post anything. I don't care about this. Then your trauma is going to be intensified and worsened and more difficult to deal with. So what we need to do is have our bosses be receptive to the idea that this is happening to us, and to come up with an action plan. And part of that action plan has to be something like, how are we going to moderate comments in the future? How are we going to protect this journalist? Do we maybe not announce that this journalist is going to be somewhere if they're being stalked? We see this in the US now, where female broadcasters need to go out with male accompaniment because their fans are becoming a little bit too involved in their personal lives, following them on Facebook, following where they go. So the boss has to say, okay, in this situation, I will make sure that you have security with you. Your boss also has to be thinking about this proactively. If you pitch a story that's going to potentially cause an uproar, potentially bring this harassment on you, your boss has to speak with you in advance. Are you ready to handle this? How can we help you? And you have to, in some way, figure out how best to minimize the damage to that person, right? That's the role of the boss in this situation. That means you have to come up with social media guidelines, which unfortunately we still don't always have in-house in Germany. And I mean more than just etiquette, but actually media guidelines. Do we erase these comments? Do we report these people? What do we see as a threat that's worthy of telling the actual person that it's been made against? We also know that we need the support of our colleagues. And that can be just a colleague saying, let's go grab a coffee and forget about this right now. I'm here for you whenever you need to talk. It also might mean that colleague stepping into your rescue, or stepping in as your voice, because if you decided that you don't want to have this conversation with this person who's trolling you, maybe that colleague will be better able to handle that conversation by taking you out of it and focusing on the facts with that person. These are all things that you can do as a boss or as a colleague. But one of the examples I have actually from the US was that Vanity Fair, Vanity Fair, the magazine, published a critical review of Trump's steakhouse. And they knew that if you published anything critical about Donald Trump, that it would bring along with it this troll army. And we also know, we've seen, that this experiences that people have had with harassment online have crossed over into the real world. And so they told the receptionist at the Condé Nast offices, don't allow anybody to call this reporter for the next 3 days. They were mitigating the damage to her by not allowing anybody to call in threats to her. These are very simple steps that you can take to help your female colleagues who might be targeted. That's a bit of what I've just talked about, but I think that the most important thing that you need to remember is that the law is different in every state, in every nation, and you have to be familiar as the boss with what those laws are, so that you can help to guide your employee who's going through that situation in the right direction. Like I said, there's an initiative in North Rhine-Westphalia to get police protection for journalists who are being harassed called Verfolgen statt Löschen, so that they can possibly prosecute the people who are doing the harassment. Freelancers have unique dangers. We don't have bosses to protect us. We don't necessarily work in a newsroom. But the biggest thing that we have to remember when we're talking about the dangers to freelancers is that there is economic damage being done to women who are targeted, because we not only have to follow these up ourselves legally, we have also experienced that people are using libel laws to sue you if you out them for being a stalker or for being abusive, and you have to take all of the legal channels and incur those costs yourselves. But also, we're noticing that publications are less willing to work with journalists who've been harassed online. And we need to, as editors who work with freelancers, say, we understand that you've been harassed, but we're still interested in your story, and take that into account. At the same time, you have to protect yourself differently. I think one of the rules in Germany that we need to work on in terms of freelancers is that we have to have an online presence with an impressum with our address on it, and that does endanger female journalists. If people very clearly can see where your office is or where your home is, that's something that we need to look at. What I said in this slide is what won't work. This is actually not true that it won't work. These are the tips that we've been given to date. That you should be publishing under a pseudonym, that you should be publishing, you should self-censor. What we also know is that about 1/3 of all women who report having been targeted will stop a story. They'll drop whatever they were doing because they don't want to continue to be targeted. That means that the governments who are releasing troll armies against people are getting their way, right? We need to have another look at this advice that we're giving women and see how we can make it easier for them, right? This is the advice that we've been given, and we've noticed also that it's not working. We've seen now also that a lot of this digital harassment has crossed over into real life. We have reporters who are reporting having been raped in real life after having received rape videos or rape threats from others within their country. We need to take more active steps to know that it's not just making women shrink from the digital world, that these threats are taken more seriously. And one last slide before I open for questions is just a list of resources that you can have a look at. There's a ton of resources online. UNESCO just released a module that they announced last week. There's a UNESCO Safety for Journalists handbook that includes a chapter on women dealing with digital hate squads. The OSCE has a gender representative that has created a documentary in which 5 women detail very in detail their experiences with this kind of harassment. But then they also recommend that you get some training that they would normally give to reporters who would go into war zones on how to keep yourself safe online. So the Rory Peck Trust does that very well, and the Dart Center as well. Good. I'm sorry, I only left a few minutes for questions, but I'm happy to take any if you have them.
Ja, danke schon mal, Courtney. Are there any questions? Yes, wait a minute, ein Moment.
Hello, my question is, when you are a journalist, I think you hear me, yeah. When you are a journalist, online your main objective is to be present and visible, so that's why you need to, because I want views on my article and be famous as my name, but most of the tips that you actually gave are against that. It's like because anonymity and stuff like that. So how do you balance the both, trying to be famous as a woman journalist and as well protect myself against harassment? Thank you.
I think that's $1 million question, right? I think that all of the tips that we've been given to date have been that we should shrink ourselves from online. And when we're freelancers, we need to have a public presence. That means that a lot of females who have created a big public presence for themselves have also incorporated friends who will go in and argue with whoever is threatening them. One famous feminist that I know has her dad go in and argue with everybody. Yeah, it's cute, but it's not. Right? I think what we're at is that this advice that we've been given is based on an analog world where we're not making our own careers online. And unfortunately, we just haven't come up with any good solutions to this. There are solutions that the OSCE has forwarded that they want for addressing this, which means that we need to make things more punitive under the laws that currently exist, that we need to in some way also expand our digital laws, but for the moment, this is the advice that's been given to us, and we need to in some way find workarounds or solutions in that respect. I think, like I said, $1 million question, right? I think most women will say, well, then we just don't use that hashtag, or we just don't do this, or we just don't do that. Everybody has to find the solution that's right for themselves, but it's not actually a great solution. Yeah. So.
Gibt es noch Fragen? Wir hätten noch Zeit für eine.
Hello, thank you for the talk. For me as a guy, what's your advice? You already said if you're in a position of power, see something, say something. But now I'm considering I might know a lot of might have a lot of male friends who would be inclined to send a dick pic or to participate in online harassment. It's simple statistics. Probably a lot of guys who wouldn't admit it to themselves, or you wouldn't think of them like doing something like that. So what would you recommend to me to bring the issue forward, so to say, to do a little thing, because to me, like 2-3 years ago, it was simply unimaginable that people would behave in such a way.
Yeah.
So what could the average guy do who?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that we've known about in the U.S. for years, right? We've had about 10 years of experience with it. Women have been filing harassment claims for 5 years. I think the conversation needs to be had with your male friends. I think you need to go in there and say, man, this is not cool. Yeah, this woman does not need to see your penis. You do not need to be saying these things. And actually have these conversations with them. Why are you doing this, right? I think that the issue of what men should do is something that men need to discuss among themselves. What are we willing to have as a society? And are we willing to allow this toxicity to be expressed in a digital world? Because we know that not all men do this, right? And we need to be having these conversations, women and men. But it's not our job as women to be telling men how to behave, right? But maybe you guys can talk amongst each other and say, this isn't working, this isn't cool, I don't like this. It's not up to women to tell men how to behave, right? That's something we've been doing for years. We've been saying this doesn't work for us. And if you're willing now to listen to that, that's really great. But I don't think it's our place necessarily to say, stop acting like this. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to understand that there's a moral code in the society that we exist in, and that moral code has to be that we respect women as equally as men. Yeah. Does that help?
Of course, ein perfektes Schlusswort. Danke, Courtney. Applaus nochmal für Courtney dafür. Und hier geht's weiter um 11:15 Uhr. Und zwar wird da ein Förderprogramm vorgestellt vom Medienboard Berlin-Brandenburg, also von dem Gastgeber heute hier, und der Canadian Media Fund. Was ihn da verbirgt, ab 11:15 Uhr erfahrt ihr mehr. Dankeschön.